Welcome to this deep dive into one of the most unsettling cases in early American history. Today, we step into the shadows of the Appalachian wilderness, where an entire family was swallowed by the unforgiving winter of 1847 without a single trace. Tell us where you're watching from, because you need to understand this story has never been fully resolved. It was December when everything began to unravel in Bell County, Kentucky. The Appalachian Mountains at that time were a world unto themselves, a place of near total isolation. Families lived days apart from one another, separated by deep hollows, impenetrable thickets of hemlock and birch, and a persistent fog that seemed to muffle every sound. The bitter cold of that winter had settled in early, turning the creeks to glass at their edges. It was a land where law enforcement barely functioned, where deputies needed weeks to comb the hollows, and where family secrets were buried under generations of silence and hard tradition. The Hargrove family lived on a remote homestead on the upper ridges of the Cumberland mountain range. There were 7 of them: Patriarch Elias Hargrove, his wife Agnes, and 5 children ranging from age 5 to 17. Elias was a quiet, deliberate man, one who measured his words carefully, but never shied away from labor. He had constructed his cabin with his own 2 hands, using poplar logs he felled from the hillside himself. The property sat nearly a mile off the main trace that connected the region's sparse farms to the small settlement of Yellow Creek Crossing. No one saw them often. This was not unusual in that time and place. Appalachian families could vanish into themselves for entire seasons during harsh winters when the trails became impassable. But there was something different about the Hargroves. Their nearest neighbors, who lived a solid 3 miles away, noted that the family seemed perpetually on edge, always scanning the tree line, always braced for something terrible to emerge from the forest. They were watchful in a way that went beyond normal frontier caution. The last confirmed contact with the family came on November 19, 1847. Elias had traveled down to the general store at the settlement to purchase provisions: cornmeal, salt, lamp oil, and lead shot for his rifle. The proprietor, a man named Isaiah Combs, recorded the transaction in his account ledger, a book that is still housed in the Bell County Historical Records Office. Isaiah would later tell investigators that Elias behaved strangely that day. He seemed jumpy, restless, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, as though he expected someone to appear at any moment. When Isaiah asked if something was the matter, Elias only mumbled something about the cold arriving early and left in a hurry. That was the last time anyone saw Elias Hargrove alive, or any member of his family. The first weeks of December came and went without alarm. As mentioned, losing track of a remote family during winter was not unheard of. But as Christmas drew near, Dorothy Hanson grew increasingly uneasy. She had promised Agnes Hargrove that she would bring dried fruit preserves and a loaf of sweetbread before the holiday. It was a small tradition among the few women scattered through those mountains, a thread of human warmth woven across the solitude. Dorothy made the trek to the Hargrove homestead on December 28th. Heavy snowfall over the preceding days had blanketed every trail with a thick white layer. It took her nearly 4 hours to reach the property, and when she finally spotted the cabin through the bare winter trees, something felt immediately wrong. No smoke rose from the chimney, no sound of children, no livestock noise from the small barn alongside the house. Only silence. Thick, absolute silence, broken only by the low moan of wind moving through bare branches. Dorothy called out to the Hargroves. Nothing. She approached the front door and knocked first softly, then with urgency. Still nothing. The door was unlatched, which struck her as deeply wrong. Frontier families always barred their doors, especially in cold months, and especially at night. Dorothy pushed the door open, and the groan of its iron hinges echoed through an empty house. Inside, the cabin was frozen through. The hearth had gone cold for days, perhaps longer. Tin plates sat on the table as though a meal had been cut short without warning. An iron pot rested on the wood stove, its contents, some kind of bean stew, solidified into a frozen block. The sleeping pallets were thrown into disarray, blankets heaped aside, as though people had risen in sudden haste. Yet there was no sign of violence, no broken furniture, no blood on the walls, no evidence of a struggle. Dorothy moved through every room. She found clothing hanging in pegs, personal belongings undisturbed, and the family Bible lying open on a small shelf near the window, but no people. The 7 members of the Hargrove family had simply ceased to exist, as though the winter night had reached through the walls and taken them. Shaking, Dorothy returned to her homestead and told her husband what she had found. He immediately gathered 4 neighboring men, and they returned before dark. They searched the house again, the barn, the root cellar. The animals were also gone. 2 milk cows, a mule, and a small flock of hens vanished completely. But here was the thing that unsettled them most. There were no tracks in the snow, no footprints leading away from the property in any direction, no sign that any creature, human or otherwise, had passed through that snow recently. Word spread slowly through the hollows, passed hand to hand through a sparse network of isolated families. In early January 1848, the Bell County Sheriff finally arrived to investigate. He brought 2 deputies and spent 3 days combing the area. What they found in the barn disturbed them considerably. There were marks on the packed dirt floor, deep gouges as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. But the marks stopped abruptly and did not continue outside the barn doors. Whatever was dragged had simply ceased to be dragged. There was no continuation, no blood, no destination. Sheriff Nathan Boone was not an easily rattled man. He had served 15 years in Kentucky law enforcement and had witnessed things that would break most men, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. No bodies, no blood, no clear evidence of crime, just 7 people and a barnyard full of animals, gone like morning mist burning off the ridgeline. Boone began interviewing everyone who knew the Hargroves, which amounted to very few people. The family had moved to the area only 3 years prior, from somewhere in southwestern Virginia. No one knew exactly where. Elias never spoke of his origins, and Agnes was even closer off. The children, on the rare occasions they appeared at the settlement, kept their eyes down and stayed close to their mother. A farmer named Silas Bowen told the sheriff something that deepened the unease. About 2 weeks before the family's disappearance, he had been tracking deer through the upper woods when he heard screaming from the direction of the Hargrove property. High, desperate screaming that cut through the cold air and bounced off the ridges. Silas had considered going to investigate, but the distance was considerable and dusk was already falling. He also admitted he was frightened, not of the Hargroves themselves, but of whatever was producing those sounds. After a few minutes, the screaming stopped, and Silas returned home, convincing himself he must have heard a wildcat or the wind playing tricks. Another neighbor, an elderly man named Cornelius Marsh, told the sheriff he had observed strange lights moving through the woods near the Hargrove property on several nights in late November. Not lanterns, not campfires, they were pale, bluish-white lights that drifted between the trees as though floating just above the ground. Cornelius was known in the community as a level-headed man, not prone to fancy or superstition, yet he admitted those lights left him deeply shaken. He had followed them one evening, only to find that they always appeared farther away than they seemed, and eventually disappeared altogether, leaving no trace of their passage.
Sheriff Boone recorded all of this in his official journal, which is now preserved in the Bell County archives. He also turned up something significant while reviewing store records. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Elias Hargrove had purchased an unusually large quantity of curing salt. Not ordinary table salt, but coarse rock salt, the kind used to preserve large cuts of meat through a long winter. Isaiah Combs estimated that Elias had bought enough salt to preserve a full-grown steer, possibly more. Yet there was no preserved meat in the cabin, only that frozen stew and a small crust of molded bread in the pantry. The salt, like everything else, had vanished. In mid-January, Boone expanded the search. He organized 20 volunteers to scour the surrounding forest in a roughly 15-mile radius. They searched through knee-high snow and temperatures that plunged below freezing at night for 5 grueling days. They found only trees, ice-encased boulders, and the oppressive silence of a winter mountain forest. Then, on the 5th day, one volunteer stumbled upon something in a hidden ravine roughly 2 miles north of the Hargrove homestead. Partially covered by drifted snow and fallen timber, he found a scrap of cloth, a child's garment, torn and soiled but recognizable. Dorothy Hanson identified it at once. It had belonged to the Hargroves' youngest child, a 5-year-old girl named Nora. The garment was stained, but not with blood. It was something else, dark and viscous, something no one could name. Boone carefully collected the cloth and ordered a thorough clearing of the ravine. It took 2 full days to clear the accumulated snow, branches, and debris from the area. They found nothing else. Not another garment, not a bone, not a single additional trace of the Hargrove family. Speculation ran through the community like fever. Some believed the family had fled in the night out of fear of someone or something, but that theory collapsed under scrutiny. No family fleeing in terror would leave behind their Bible, their winter clothes, and the family's savings, which Boone's men found sealed in a small tin buried in the kitchen wall. $47 in gold and silver coin, a small fortune by the standards of the time. No family walks away from that. Others whispered darker theories. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried older stories than what's written in any history book. Elders spoke of entities in the deep forest, presences that existed long before any settlers arrived, that sometimes claimed those who built their homes in places that were never meant to be claimed. Sheriff Boone didn't put stock in such stories, but even he was forced to acknowledge that no rational explanation fit the evidence before him. He continued his investigation for weeks, traveling to neighboring settlements, checking for any record of a family of 7 passing through. He queried wagon road traders and consulted the records of several coaching inns. No one had seen the Hargroves. In February, the investigation took a sudden and strange turn. A trapper named Amos Kettler was setting snares along a frozen creek roughly 6 miles from the Hargrove homestead when he discovered something lodged in the ice at the water's edge. It was a book, waterlogged, partially frozen in the bank ice. When he worked it free and thawed it near his fire, he found it was a personal diary, Agnes Hargrove's diary. Amos brought the diary to the sheriff immediately. Many pages were water-damaged and barely legible, but fragments of text survived, and what those fragments said sent a chill through everyone who read them. Agnes wrote about fear, a consuming, escalating fear that had spread through the family like a sickness. She wrote that Elias had been seeing things in the forest, things he refused to describe clearly to her. She wrote that the children were suffering from terrible nightmares, waking in the night screaming, speaking of figures watching them through the window glass. In an entry from early November, Agnes had written something that made no clear sense on its own. They want what we brought with us. Elias says we must leave, but there is nowhere they will not eventually find us. Who were they? What had the family brought with them? The diary offered no clean answer, only the raw, fragmentary record of a household living through mounting terror. The final legible entry was dated November 17th, 2 days before Elias made his last visit to the store. Agnes had written only 6 words, the handwriting shaky and uneven. Someone is at the door again. The discovery of the diary transformed the investigation entirely. Boone understood now that he was not dealing with a simple case of a family relocating or fleeing creditors. Something far darker had been unfolding at that homestead, and it had been building for some time. He ordered a new methodical search of the cabin itself, this time specifically looking for whatever the family might have hidden or brought with them, something significant enough to attract dangerous attention. The search consumed 3 full days. Boone's men lifted floorboards, checked the walls for concealed recesses, and dug carefully around the foundation. On the second day, they found something. Hidden beneath a loose hearthstone in the fireplace, wrapped tightly in waxed cloth, was a bundle of documents. They were property deeds, not for the Bell County land the Hargroves had been working, but for land in southwestern Virginia, near the Tennessee border. The deeds were dated 2026 and made out to a man named Cornelius Aldgate. Also in the bundle were letters, old and brittle, that told a disturbing story. Cornelius Aldgate had been a prosperous land speculator and tobacco broker in Virginia. The letters indicated he had acquired his land holdings through deeply questionable means, possibly by defrauding indigenous families who still maintained claim to the land and resisted colonial expansion. One letter, written by a solicitor named Harlan Pruitt, warned Aldgate explicitly, "You should consider abandoning this territory, Cornelius. There are forces here beyond what any court in this Commonwealth can restrain." But what did Cornelius Aldgate have to do with Elias Hargrove? Boone spent weeks tracing genealogical records and family registries. Eventually, he uncovered the connection. Elias Hargrove was born Elias Aldgate, Cornelius's grandson. He had changed his surname deliberately, apparently trying to distance himself from something tied to his grandfather's history. The implications were deeply unsettling. Had descendants of the families wronged by Cornelius been hunting Elias all along? Had they finally located him and his family hiding in the Kentucky mountains? But even this theory could not account for the total absence of physical evidence. No bodies, no blood, no trail. The animals were gone too, which no ordinary band of pursuers would take any interest in.
Boone made a decision that few sheriffs of his era would have attempted. He would travel to Virginia, to the land described in those deeds, and investigate at the source. It was a journey of nearly 200 miles over difficult terrain, requiring several days on horseback. He set out in late February 1848, taking a deputy named Charles Huff and copies of all the documents he had recovered. The region where Cornelius Aldgate's land had been located was a place called Widow's Hollow, a narrow valley hemmed in by steep ridges and forests so dense that midday sunlight barely reached the ground. The nearest settlement was a scattered cluster of households called Grimstone, home to no more than 15 families. When Boone arrived and began asking about Cornelius Aldgate, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Silence. Doors pulled shut. Conversations ended mid-sentence. It was as though the name itself was something dangerous to speak aloud. Eventually, Boone found someone willing to talk, an old man named Fletcher Cray, who was well past his 70s, recognized the name Aldgate and visibly stiffened when it was mentioned. He led the sheriff away from the settlement to a secluded spot in the woods before speaking. Fletcher explained that Cornelius Aldgate had stolen land belonging to a family called the Aldermores, one of the oldest families in the region, predating most of the colonial settlements entirely. The Aldermores were not ordinary settlers. They maintained traditions that came from across the ocean, mixed with older knowledge passed to them by the original native inhabitants of those mountains. When Cornelius stole their land in 1826, the Aldermores did not seek legal recourse. They did something different instead. Fletcher wouldn't go into detail, but he made his meaning clear. The Aldermores had bound a curse to Cornelius Aldgate and every person who carried his blood. Cornelius died just 2 years later under circumstances that were never adequately explained, his body found in the forest with no clear cause of death. His son, Elias's father, had disappeared completely when Elias was still a young child. Boone felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold. He didn't believe in curses. He had never believed in anything he could not see and measure. But the internal logic of the story he was being told was disturbingly coherent. He asked Fletcher whether the Aldermores were still in the area. The old man nodded slowly and pointed toward the deeper mountains to the east. They were still there, he said. As far as anyone could tell, they had always been there and always would be. He gave Boone rough directions. Follow the creek upstream for about 8 miles, then look for a trail marked with stacked field stones and follow it until it ended. Boone and Deputy Huff set out the following morning. The journey was considerably harder than expected. The forest grew denser and darker as they climbed, the terrain increasingly rough. After hours of difficult travel, they found the stacked stones Fletcher had described. The trail beyond was almost invisible, overgrown with moss and overarched by ancient trees that seemed deliberately lean overhead. 2 miles further, the trail opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a stone cabin, dark, low, covered in lichen, with smoke rising steadily from its chimney. Boone called out, identifying himself as the county sheriff. No answer. He called again, louder. The cabin door opened. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was extraordinarily old, her skin like dried bark over bone, her eyes a pale gray so light they were almost colorless. When she fixed those eyes on Boone, he had the unsettling sense that she was reading something in him that he himself had never seen. She said nothing, only watched. Boone explained his purpose, mentioned the Hargroves, the disappearance, the documents. The woman listened without expression until he finished. Then she spoke, her voice like dead leaves dragged across stone. She said only, "The obligation has been fulfilled." Then she stepped back into the cabin and pulled the door closed. No amount of knocking, calling, or threatening caused her to reappear. Deputy Huff was ashen-faced and begged to leave immediately. Boone had to agree. The clearing seemed to press the light out of itself even in the middle of the afternoon. As they prepared to go, Boone noticed markings etched into the frozen ground surrounding the cabin, complex circles and symbols he did not recognize. And hanging from the trees encircling the clearing on lengths of cord were bones, small bones, dozens of them, swaying in the barely perceptible wind, producing a soft, rhythmic clicking that was somehow worse than silence. The walk back to Grimstone took considerably less time than the outbound journey, powered by an urgent and unexamined desire to put distance between themselves and that clearing. When they reached the settlement, old Fletcher Cray was waiting at the only inn, as though he had expected them. He took one look at their faces, asked no questions, poured strong whiskey, and advised them to leave at first light. That night, Boone barely slept. He kept turning the woman's words over in his mind. The obligation has been fulfilled. What exactly had been fulfilled? Had the Hargroves been taken as payment for a crime committed by their ancestor more than 20 years earlier? And if so, where were they? Why was there no physical evidence of any kind? Before leaving, Boone had one final conversation with Fletcher Cray. The old man was more forthcoming now that the sheriff would soon be gone. He spoke of the Aldermore family's reputation, passed down through generations of mountain storytelling. He said the family possessed knowledge that was genuinely ancient, knowledge about how to move between this world and other layers of existence that lay alongside it in the places just out of sight. He said that the Aldermores, when they marked someone, they marked the entire bloodline. It was not simple revenge. It was closer to cosmic accounting, the restoration of a balance that had been broken, the closing of a wound in the natural order. And once that kind of reckoning was set in motion, nothing in the ordinary world had the power to stop it. Boone returned to Bell County in early April 1848. More disturbing news was waiting for him. During his absence, 3 more people had vanished. Not Hargroves, but individuals connected to the case. One of the men who had assisted in the original search of the property left his home one evening and never returned. His wife waited 3 days before raising an alarm, and the subsequent search found nothing. 2 weeks after that, a woman who had taken some clothing from the Hargrove cabin, believing the family was gone for good, also disappeared without explanation, and then another. The community began to panic. People stopped speaking of the Hargroves openly. They avoided passing near the abandoned property. Some began to whisper that the land itself carried the mark, that anyone who touched it, or anything belonging to it, would be next. Boone came to a decision. He could not resolve this case through any method available to him. He drafted a carefully vague official report stating that the Hargrove family appeared to have abandoned their property for unknown reasons, and that despite exhaustive efforts, no trace of them had been located. He noted the child's garment and the recovered diary as artifacts, but omitted entirely his journey to Virginia and everything he had learned about the Aldermores. But Boone also kept a second private journal, separate from all official records, in which he wrote everything, every detail, every moment in which something rational inside him had buckled and bent toward belief in the impossible. That journal would not be discovered for over a century. In the spring of 1848, Boone ordered the Hargrove cabin burned. Officially, the reason given was structural hazard and fire risk. Everyone in the region understood the real reason. The cabin burned through an entire night, its glow visible from the high ridges. People who watched it burn reported hearing sounds within the fire that unsettled them, almost like human voices, but as they drew closer, the sounds resolved into the crackle of burning timber and the moan of wind. By morning, nothing remained but a blackened patch of earth and scattered stone. The disappearances stopped. Life slowly returned to its hard-edged mountain rhythm, but the case was never truly closed. 7 people had vanished without rational explanation. The Virginia property deeds and the accompanying letters were filed in the county archives, where they sat undisturbed for decades. Agnes Hargrove's damaged diary was preserved as evidence, though evidence of what precisely no one could say. Nathan Boone served as sheriff for another 10 years before stepping down. Those who knew him said the case had changed him in ways he never discussed. He drank more than before, spoke less, and he was sometimes seen standing at the edge of his property in the evenings, staring at the eastern mountains with an expression that looked very much like contained dread.
Years passed. The story of the Hargrove family became regional legend, told in hushed tones with glances at the shadows. Details eroded, others accumulated, and the true events were slowly buried under layers of fear and oral tradition. During the 1850s, the area around Yellow Creek Crossing grew modestly. New settlers arrived, roads improved. The old Hargrove property, now just a scorched clearing slowly being reclaimed by secondary growth, was eventually sold at public auction for back taxes. A farmer named Cornelius Fitch purchased it for a small sum, dismissing the warnings of older residents as mountain superstition. He built a new house on the same footprint as the original Hargrove cabin. For the first few months, nothing unusual occurred. He worked the land, raised livestock, and was expecting his first child with his wife Catherine. They spoke of this place as the beginning of something new. But in the autumn of 1855, things changed. Cornelius began waking in the night to the sound of footsteps on the porch, though investigation always showed no one there. Catherine reported seeing shapes moving in the corners of rooms, shapes that vanished the moment she looked directly at them. The horses refused to approach certain areas of the property, rearing and shaking when driven near the site of the old cabin foundation. In November of that year, exactly 8 years after the Hargroves had vanished, Catherine went into labor. The delivery was premature and difficult, and the infant, a boy, lived only 4 days. The midwife who attended the birth would not return to the property afterward. She never described exactly what she had witnessed, only muttered something about markings on the child's skin, patterns that had no natural explanation.
After the infant's death, Catherine began suffering severe night episodes. She would wake screaming, insisting she could see children at the windows, pale children in old clothing, pressing their hands against the glass and staring in at her. Cornelius never witnessed anything when he rushed to check, but Catherine's deterioration was rapid. Within weeks, she refused to sleep in any room whose windows faced the tree line. By early December, Cornelius made the decision to leave. He had put everything he owned into that land, but no amount of investment was worth what was happening to his wife or to his own increasingly unstable mind. They left one cold morning, carrying only what they could manage, and never returned. The house sat empty, and the forest began the slow work of reclaiming it. During the Civil War years, the Kentucky mountains became contested ground. Both Union and Confederate forces moved through the region on multiple occasions. In the autumn of 1863, military records document a disturbing incident near what had once been the Hargrove estate. A detachment of 23 Union soldiers was making camp in the vicinity, unaware of the property's history. On the first night, 2 sentries posted at the perimeter of the camp were found missing at morning muster. Initially assumed to be deserters, though it was strange that 2 men would desert simultaneously, leaving all their gear behind, a more troubling explanation emerged when 3 more soldiers vanished on the second night. The detachment commander, a major named Ezra Holt, ordered the men to maintain absolute formation and keep fires burning through the night. The soldiers reported hearing sounds in the surrounding darkness, large-scale movement in the trees, as though a substantial group were circling their position, but every attempt to illuminate the area with torches revealed nothing but darkness and forest. On the third night, the entire detachment broke and fled in panic. The official Union report attributed the incident to a Confederate guerrilla ambush, but Holt's private diary, discovered decades later, describes something altogether different. Pale figures at the edge of firelight, a terror that moved through his men like electricity, and 7 of his soldiers gone, without a body recovered. In the late 19th century, a folklore scholar named Edgar Holloway traveled through the Appalachians collecting regional stories and legends. He spent several weeks in Bell County in 1898, interviewing elderly residents and reviewing old county documents. He was the first to formally compile the Hargrove case in writing. He also made the same journey to Virginia that Boone had made 50 years earlier, following the same path to Widow's Hollow, searching for the Aldermore family and the stone cabin in the mountains. He found nothing. The trail described by Fletcher Cray had vanished completely, overgrown and undetectable. The Grimstone settlement was smaller and more derelict than in Boone's time, and the remaining residents denied any knowledge of a family called Aldermore. Some denied the family had ever existed at all. Holloway published a small volume in 1901 titled Shadows in the Cumberland Hills, with the Hargrove chapter as its centerpiece. He made no effort to impose a rational explanation. The book had limited circulation and eventually faded from print, but copies survive in several university library collections. In 1925, a young historian named Arthur Prescott, pursuing doctoral research at the University of Kentucky, decided to investigate the Hargrove case in depth. He had access to better organized records than Holloway had possessed, along with the ability to travel between states far more efficiently. He spent 2 years on the research, and what he uncovered was both remarkable and deeply disturbing. Prescott traced the entire Aldgate family lineage, from Cornelius through to Elias. What he found was a pattern. Each generation had experienced inexplicable catastrophe. Cornelius's son, Elias's father, had vanished in 1836, along with his wife, leaving the young Elias an orphan at the age of 9, raised by extended family members who did not carry the Aldgate name, which likely explains why he survived to adulthood. But the extended family told a consistent story. Cousins, half-siblings, anyone carrying Aldgate blood seemed followed by a pattern of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. Most disturbingly, Prescott discovered that there were living Aldgate descendants, people who had no idea of their connection to Cornelius and the stolen Virginia land. They had changed their names over generations, just as Elias had done, but the bloodline remained unbroken. Prescott managed to contact 3 of these individuals for interviews. All 3 reported lifelong experiences that followed a recognizable pattern: recurring nightmares of dark forests and watching figures, persistent feelings of being followed or observed, stretches of unexplained misfortune. One of them, a man named Wallace Prater, said something that stayed with Prescott. "There has always been something wrong with our family. Something has been following us. I have known it all my life." With this understanding, Prescott made a decision that no one had made in generations. He would visit the old Hargrove property in person. In the summer of 1925, he made the journey. The site was more isolated than he had imagined. No road came within 5 miles of it. He hiked the remainder along barely visible old traces, and when he finally located the clearing, he was struck by how completely the forest had erased what had stood there. The ruins of Cornelius Fitch's house were faintly visible beneath decades of vegetation, trees growing through the collapsed walls, roots breaking through the stone floor. The place had a quality of silence that Prescott could not easily describe. No birdsong, no insects, no movement in the undergrowth, just a pressing, absolute quiet that felt less like an absence of sound and more like something actively holding sound away. Prescott began a careful survey of the site, photographing with his plate camera and taking notes. He located what he believed was the original Hargrove hearth, a scatter of blackened stones, frost-heaved and overgrown, and he then began carefully excavating around them, hoping to find artifacts that survived the burning of 1848. And it was then that he found the bones. Buried roughly 2 feet beneath the surface, carefully arranged in a configuration suggested deliberate placement rather than concealment. Prescott was no forensic anthropologist, but he had enough anatomical knowledge to identify what he was looking at: human bones, multiple individuals. He uncovered 7 skulls in total, 5 of modest size, 1 medium, 1 large, an entire family. Along with the bones were surface markings, not natural wear, not fracture patterns, but deliberately carved symbols etched with precision into each bone after death. Prescott understood that he had made an extraordinary discovery. He photographed everything, carefully reburied the remains to protect them, marked the exact location, and left to arrange a proper forensic excavation. He never arranged it. 3 days after leaving the property, the nightmares began, the same nightmares that living Aldgate descendants had described to him. Dark forests, watching figures, whispers in languages he could not place. A week later, Prescott's automobile left a straight, dry road near Lexington for no apparent mechanical reason. Witnesses described seeing figures in the road ahead of him, though no one was found at the scene. Prescott survived the crash, but spent 3 months
recovering from fractures and a significant head injury. When he was released, he was a measurably different person. He abandoned the Hargrove research entirely. He sealed all his notes, photographs, and field documents in a wooden box, instructed that it never be opened, and spent the remainder of his academic career writing about Kentucky agricultural economics, safe, grounded, bounded topics that kept him far from dark hollows and cursed bloodlines. Arthur Prescott died in 1971. His sealed materials were donated to the University of Kentucky archives by his heirs, who had no understanding of what the box contained. The Hargrove story sat dormant through World War II and into the post-war decades. The former property remained untouched amid the gradual modernization of the surrounding region. Logging operations that came close to the area repeatedly failed in unexplained ways, equipment breaking down without cause, workers refusing to continue, supervisors filing puzzling incident reports about compasses that would not hold bearing, and animals that would not enter the zone. The old-growth trees at that specific site were never felled, forming an island of ancient forest in an otherwise altered landscape. In the autumn of 1975, 5 college students from the University of Kentucky, drawn by a passing reference to the Hargrove case in a library pamphlet on regional legends, decided to spend a weekend camping on the old property. They brought cameras, portable audio recorders, and the casual confidence of youth. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, set up in the ruins, and prepared for what they expected to be a mildly spooky adventure. The first strange developments came shortly after dark. Low whispers from the surrounding trees, barely audible, impossible to localize. One of the students, a young woman named Margaret Hollis, said she kept seeing shapes at the edge of the firelight, always retreating the moment she tried to look directly at them. Shortly after midnight, the audio recorders began picking up sounds that were inaudible to the group but came through clearly on playback. Multiple voices overlapping in a rhythmic pattern, fragmented words. "Leave this place. It has no welcome for you. What was brought here cannot be removed." At roughly 2 a.m, all 5 students reported the same experience simultaneously. 5 children emerging from the tree line. Small children in tattered period clothing, moving without natural walking motion, gliding. Their faces were pale to the point of luminescence, and their eyes held no whites. The group fled in absolute panic, abandoning all their equipment and running for the road. 2 days later, one of the students, a young man named Thomas Vane, returned in daylight with 2 friends to retrieve what had been left behind. When they reached the campsite, they found the equipment arranged in a precise pile at the center of the ruins. The cameras had been opened and the film exposed. The audio recorders had been disassembled, their magnetic tape unwound and laid in careful circular patterns around the equipment pile. Thomas never publicly discussed what he had seen that night. He and the other 4 made a quiet agreement to say nothing, but Margaret Hollis kept a private journal of everything, the events, and the years of recurring nightmares that followed. In 1997, exactly 150 years after the original disappearance, a documentary filmmaker named Richard Caulfield became interested in the Hargrove mystery. He found Arthur Prescott's sealed archive in the university stacks and, unaware of the full history, opened it. Inside were Prescott's field notes, his photographic plates, his maps, and most significantly, the precise coordinates of the excavation site where he had found the buried bones. Excited by the discovery, Caulfield organized an expedition. Himself, a cameraman named James Reeve, a sound engineer named Marcus Pruitt, and a local mountain guide in his 60s named Earl Dawson. They set out on a clear September morning. Earl grew visibly more agitated as they approached the site, muttering about how his father had told him to stay away from that particular ridge, how the locals had always avoided it, how even the deer seemed to move around it rather than through it. They reached the ruins by mid-afternoon. Using Prescott's coordinates, they located the excavation site and began a careful exploratory dig. About 15 inches down, their tools struck bone. They cleared the surrounding earth carefully with gloved hands and revealed remains, but something was immediately wrong. The bones were not a normal color. They were nearly black, and every surface was covered in the same carved symbols Prescott had photographed 70 years earlier. Identical symbols. James filmed everything. The sound engineer, Marcus, kept reporting interference in his equipment, a low, persistent hum with no identifiable source, and periodic bursts of what his recorder captured as whispering voices. Earl Dawson begged them to stop and leave. His voice had lost its professional composure entirely. Then, among the ancient bones, partially buried in the dark soil, James found something that should not have been there. A small metal pin, tarnished but legible. On the back, an inscription, "Margaret Hollis,
class of 1977. Margaret had visited the site in 1975. Her pin had no rational means of ending up buried with remains dating to the 1840s. The silence that followed the discovery lasted for just a moment. Earl was the first to look up. Standing among the trees in every direction were figures, still, watching. Indeterminate in number, the shifting light and shadows made it impossible to count them. James raised his camera and looked through the viewfinder. Through the lens, he saw only empty forest. He lowered the camera. The figures were there. He raised it again. Nothing. Marcus's instruments were producing readings that should have been physically impossible. Earl ran. He simply turned and disappeared into the forest at a dead sprint. The others followed, fighting through brush rather than following the open trails where the figures seemed concentrated. They ran until the oppressive quality of the air changed, until the forest around them felt like ordinary forest again. They made it to their vehicles. Earl was already there, sitting on the ground. No one spoke on the drive out. Caulfield canceled the documentary and ordered all footage destroyed. But James Reeve had kept the memory cards from that afternoon's filming stored in his jacket pocket as a routine backup. When he reviewed the footage alone later, he found something in the background of multiple shots, figures visible in the tree line that had not been visible to anyone during filming, figures that appeared for single frames, then vanished. When zoomed in, they showed faces, children's faces, adult faces, all wearing expressions of unbearable distress. James made copies of those cards and locked them away. He spent the following years assembling everything he could find on the Hargrove case, a private archive that grew to fill an entire room. In 2003, James located Margaret Hollis. She was living in Canada, having left the United States decades earlier. When he mentioned the pin, she fell silent for a long moment, then told him something she had never told anyone. She had experienced the same dream, hundreds of times over 30 years, always identical. She was back in those woods at night, with bonfires burning and figures in period clothing performing some kind of ceremony around the bones. And among the figures, she recognized faces, from photographs, from historical records connected to the Hargrove case. In the dream, all the figures would turn to her simultaneously. Their eyes were all black, and they would say together, "You touched what was not yours to touch. You are part of it now." She always woke in cold sweat, heart hammering, the sense of having been seen by something that had been watching for a very long time. James and Margaret assembled a conclusion neither had reached alone. Whatever happened at that Bell County clearing in 1847 was not a closed historical event. It was ongoing. The property seemed to exist in some kind of fractured relationship with time, multiple layers of its history present simultaneously in that one place, accessible and active rather than receding into the past. And Margaret had been tracking something else, a pattern of disappearances in the mountains near the old Hargrove property, recurring every 7 years or so, stretching all the way back to the case itself. Hunters, hikers, a surveyor once. No bodies ever recovered, searches that found nothing, and always, in the days surrounding each disappearance, reports of strange lights or unidentifiable figures in the forest from multiple independent witnesses. James verified the pattern through missing persons records spanning 3 states. What he found confirmed it and added something darker. Every person who disappeared had some detectable connection to the Aldgate bloodline, to the former property, or to the ongoing investigation of the case. The connection was sometimes genealogical, sometimes physical. People who had visited the site, or handled artifacts from it, or simply studied the case in academic depth. Arthur Prescott did not disappear, but his car accident occurred within a year of his visit. The 5 students from 1975, though not gone, all experienced significant traumatic events in the years following. One died in a house fire, another developed severe psychiatric illness. The pattern held, consistent and merciless, like a clock that measured time in a unit no human calendar acknowledged. In 2015,
James received a letter from an elderly woman in western North Carolina. She had seen a brief mention of the Hargrove case in a regional mystery publication, and something in it had stirred a memory. She identified herself as a descendant of the Aldermore family, the same family that had cursed Cornelius Aldgate nearly 2 centuries earlier. Her name was Rowena Aldermore, and she was 91 years old. She wrote that her family had maintained records of everything, stories passed down through generations, accounts of the stolen land, and the binding that had been sworn in response. She explained that when the Aldermores enacted their curse, they had not simply condemned a bloodline, they had tied the debt to the land itself, creating a permanent intersection between the physical world and something older and deeper. The land had become a threshold, a point where 2 orders of reality overlapped, and the Hargrove spirits were locked within it, serving as wardens of a passage that should never have been created. Rowena wrote that her family had made attempts over the years to undo what had been done, but a binding of that kind, rooted in profound injury and woven from multiple ancient traditions, takes on a life beyond its creators. It becomes its own entity. The only path to resolution would require genuine reconciliation, real forgiveness from both sides, and the restoration of the land to those who had originally held it sacred. But how does one achieve forgiveness between parties who have all been dead for over a century? How does one restore land to those who no longer exist to receive it? Rowena died 3 weeks after sending the letter. James attended the small funeral. He met the remaining Aldermore descendants, ordinary people carrying an extraordinary and barely understood history. They confirmed Rowena's account and showed him old family records, notebooks dating back to the 1820s, documenting the rituals that had been performed, the words that had been spoken, the blood and earth and bone that had been bound together. The Aldermores of 1826 had not been seeking simple vengeance. They had been protecting something sacred, a site of power that had been respected and maintained for countless generations before any colonial settler arrived. When Cornelius Aldgate built upon it and claimed it as property, he had committed a kind of violation that their tradition recognized as requiring restoration at any cost. James finally understood the full shape of what he had spent decades investigating. The Hargrove family had not been killed in any ordinary sense. They had been drawn through a threshold, transformed into something between worlds, bound to that clearing as permanent guardians of a passage that should never have been opened. Every person who had vanished since then had been added to that guardianship, deepening the seal. It was terrible. It was also, in a framework that defied every rational category James had lived by, necessary. Today, the former Hargrove property remains untouched. It appears on official maps, but established trails curve carefully around it. The Forest Service maintains it as a wildlife reserve, though wildlife is notably sparse within its boundaries. Hazard signs nearby cite unstable terrain and erosion risk. The true reason goes unspoken in official documents. James is still alive, now in his late 70s. He continues to update his private archive. The 7-year pattern holds. The most recent disappearance occurred in 2022, a nature photographer who had dismissed the posted warnings and camped near the ruins for 3 nights. His camera was recovered on a trail nearly a mile away, memory cards intact. The photographs showed something that should not exist. The Hargrove cabin, whole and standing, warm lamplight in every window, figures moving inside, living their lives as though the year were still 1847. We may never fully understand what occurred in that Bell County clearing nearly 2 centuries ago. We may never know what the Hargrove family experience is now, if experience is still the right word. But the land remembers what happened there. The forest holds what it was given. And on still nights, when the wind comes through the Cumberland hollows, some people claim to hear children laughing, or perhaps weeping, echoes of a family suspended between worlds, paying down a debt that was never truly theirs. If this story reached something deep in you, if you felt that chill settle in as each layer of this history unfolded, please like and subscribe to the channel.
Drop a comment below if you've had any unexplained experiences in the mountains, or if you know of other stories that time has tried to bury. Sometimes the only way to honor the lost is to keep speaking their names.